Now let us take a look at types of survey. There are 2-3 major types of surveys. Okay? What are these major types of surveys? First type of survey is descriptive. There are surveys which are purely descriptive in nature. It tries to describe the phenomenon. Okay? The researcher tries to look at the phenomenon that the researcher is studying with as much accuracy as possible. The phenomenon to be studied should be studied in every aspect of that phenomenon. So accuracy is an important component of descriptive survey. The researcher tries to describe the phenomenon or the situation as the researcher sees, as the researcher perceives. The perception is also an important component. So what the researcher sees and what the researcher perceives. The aim of the researcher is to estimate the variable attributes of the population. Population is a very diverse kind of population, and there are various attributes to the population. So variable attributes of the population are to be studied. It may be a small scale survey if it is a descriptive survey. Then there are certain surveys which are exploratory in nature. If the researcher is studying something which is not explored so far, it is the intention of the researcher to highlight certain aspects of the phenomenon, certain aspects of the situation. If it is an unexplored area and the researcher is trying to throw some light on that unexplored area, then it is called as exploratory survey. The idea here is not test any hypothesis, because the situation is unknown situation. What the researcher is trying here, the researcher is trying to gather the information in such a way, the researcher is trying to explore the situation in such a way that it will enable the researcher to explore hypothesis. It enables the researcher to build a hypothesis, to seek a hypothesis. The objective here is not testing the hypothesis. Okay? It is for building up a hypothesis. Then there are analytical studies. Okay? So analytical studies attempt to analyze the given situation. It goes a step further from descriptive survey. Descriptive survey enables the researcher to understand the situation as it is. The analytical survey goes beyond, and analytical survey tries to probe beneath the figures. The figures may throw up certain situation, and the analytical survey will try to connect those variables in such a way that some kind of relationship will be established. It may be a causal relationship. For example, if it is a study of standard of living of population, we are again taking the same example, then the descriptive study will enable the researcher to understand what is the standard of living of the population in terms of income levels, in terms of education levels, in terms of employment levels, and so on. But analytical study will go a step further. What is going a step further? Analytical study will enable the researcher to arrive at a conclusion that poverty levels are high, okay, or standard of living of the population is low because the employment situation is very poor. People do not have full-term employment. Those who have employment, they do not have high income levels. So the reasoning or causal relationship is explored in analytical survey. So there is descriptive survey, there is exploratory survey, and there is analytical survey. Now these are sort of the types of surveys related to the purpose of survey. There are certain other types of surveys as well, and these are one-shot surveys. The researcher goes to the field and conducts a survey one time. Only once the researcher goes to the field, and that is one-shot survey. The survey is conducted only once. There are multiple content surveys. Researcher may go again to the field in order to find out change in the situation. For example, if a survey is conducted in crowd region, okay, then the condition of the people during a crowd may be studied by the researcher. It may be done by way of descriptive survey, analytical survey, exploratory survey, and so on. Then, if a policy measure is announced and implemented in that area, say for example, watershed development program is initiated in the area, and once that program is completed, then the researcher goes again after 2 years or after 3 years and studies the situation, studies the standard of living of the population. So, the researcher can study the change that has taken place in the situation. So, there may be one shot survey and there may be multiple contact surveys. How a survey is administered? What are the methods by which survey is conducted, or what are the tools for gathering the data which is used in survey research methodology? Now, these are very commonly used tools, and these tools are known also. Now, first and the important tool in survey research method is interview, face-to-face interview. Respondent and the interviewer will interact with each other. There may be a schedule which is prepared by the researcher, and that researcher is administering that schedule on the respondent, and that is how the interview will take place. Now, interviews again are of two types. There may be personal interview and there may be group interview. There may be a combination of both personal interview as well as group interview. Then the other method which is used is questionnaire. Questionnaires are made to the respondents. Respondents are expected to fill up those questionnaires and send them back. Usually, the experience of most of the researchers is that the rate of questionnaires reaching back to the researchers is not very high. Okay. So, if the researcher is planning to conduct a survey of certain number of respondents, researcher will have to keep additional number of respondents so that required number of questionnaires will come back. And we have seen certain disadvantages, limitations of survey research method. It is applicable here also, because researcher has no way of knowing who has filled up that questionnaire and who has mailed that questionnaire back. But in order to reach out to large population, mailed questionnaire is an important tool, and that is an important tool which the researcher uses. With the technology, there are additional tools which have come into effect. Apart from postal method, now there is telephone research. Interviews are conducted by telephone and the responses are recorded. And there are now online tools also which are used by the researchers. There is an advantage of online tool. It is possible to reach a very large number of people in a very short period of time if it is online. At the same time, the disadvantage limitation is that it is not possible to verify who is actually responding. Okay? So that limitation remains. This limitation is the same as the limitation of mailed questionnaire. So, interviews, mailed questionnaires, telephone responses and online responses. These are the tools which are used by the researcher. And now we come to an extremely important component of survey research method, and that is pilot survey. Okay? Pilot survey is some kind of preparatory survey. It is a survey which is considered as the survey in complete respect as the survey which is planned by the researcher. But it is called as pre-survey, or it is called as the pre-testing survey by the researchers. So usually pilot survey is conducted on very small scale. It tests the feasibility of the main survey of the research. It is a method by which researcher is testing whether the survey that is planned by the researcher is feasible or not. Now, feasibility is tested in many ways. What are the ways in which feasibility is tested? Every aspect of the survey can be pre-tested. The questionnaire that has been designed by the researcher, or the interview schedule that is prepared by the researcher. Researcher prepares questionnaire, prepares interview schedule and goes to the field. It is possible that some of the questions that are included in the questionnaire are not understood properly by the respondents, or it is possible very different additional kinds of information is coming in when the researcher is asking the questions. So in both cases, in first case, researcher will have to modify the questions and reformulate the questions so that the respondents will understand the questions and the respondents will answer accordingly. In another case, where additional information is coming in, which is not included in the questionnaire, which is not included in the interview schedule, but it is extremely important for the researcher. So researcher will have to include those questions, formulate the questions and include those questions in the main questionnaire that the researcher is planning to use. So it tests adequacy of the data, it tests adequacy of the sample form, variability of the population is also tested with the help of pilot survey. Pilot survey is a complete survey in itself, but it is a pre-survey. And whenever pilot survey is completed, usually it is found that most of the researchers modify their questionnaire, modify their interview schedules, and then only they go to the main field to start their main research. So George Lundberg has commented on pilot survey, the inexperienced researcher is likely to be impatient with his preliminary work because researcher is eager to start work. Researcher doesn't want to waste time on just pre-testing. Researcher feels there may be overconfidence that whatever has been planned is proper, but it may not be proper. And it may seem hair-splitting over the meaning of words and other details, but it is extremely necessary to have patience, and that patience will enable the researcher to move further. So what are the main activities in any kind of survey research? Whenever a research problem is formulated, beginning is with the identification of area, broad area of research. From broad area of research, researcher defines a research problem. When the research problem is defined, then the research process begins. So when the problem is defined, then there has to be a clear conceptualization of each and every term which is used in the title, it may be tentative, and which is used in the objectives of the research. So clear conceptualization is the first step before any survey begins. Then once the concepts are identified, they need to be translated into indicators, measurable indicators. Those indicators need to be defined very properly. Then the researcher has to decide the purpose of the research and type of the research. Both are linked to each other. If it is an opinion poll, if it is a marketing survey, then the type of research will be different. Then it may be a descriptive research. Okay? If the survey is to be conducted for initiating certain policy measures, then it may be an analytical survey, okay? Or it may be exploratory survey. So the researcher will have to decide purpose, and accordingly the type of the survey also will be decided. After that, the next step is to decide on data collection method, whether to use questionnaire, whether to use interviews, whether to use online method, or whether to use telephonic method, etc. The tool of data collection needs to be finalized. Then researcher has to decide the sample. Population needs to be defined and the sample also needs to be defined. Sample needs to be defined in such a way that that sample must be representative in nature, because the researcher will be making conclusions, drawing inferences based on the sample data which is coming to him. So sample frame is extremely important for the researcher. Every researcher must decide on pilot testing. Without pilot testing, it is extremely difficult for the researcher to be confident as to whether the survey which is planned is feasible, survey which is planned is proper or not. And once the pilot testing is done, it is extremely important to modify, to redraft the questionnaire. In some cases, the variables which are used by the researchers will also have to be clarified further. And once that modification is done, drafting is done, then the researcher is ready to implement the actual survey method. The implementation part begins after the pilot survey is completed.